So, welcome everyone to the Awaken online series on stories, crisis, and community, the final episode. And for those who have been joining us in the last two episodes, thank you so much for being a part of the series with us. My name is Layala Dabt, and I'm going to be facilitating the conversation this evening, along with my teammates, Elisa and Eleanor. If you guys could just quickly say hello so everyone can see you. Hi, everyone.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
All right. So, for those of you who have been following our previous episodes, you will know that at Envy, we strongly believe in the power of stories and their role in systems change. And we've really seen how, in times of crisis like these, that stories play such a great role in building both bridges or walls between us and our communities. And so, we thought that this would be a really ideal time to take a step back and think more critically about what stories mean, who tells them, and how they could be used for social good. So in the first episode that we hosted 2 weeks ago, our guest speakers Ghazayel Al-Harbi and Fatma Qadfan looked at the more transformative and healing power of stories and their role in personal and collective trauma, in community and in empowerment, and also in creating shared meaning and spreading compassion. And then in our second episode, we were joined by the incredible Al Naqib sisters, all three of them, and professors Dr. Rania, Dr. Farah, and Dr. May, who discussed the origins and dangers of the single story, particularly as it relates to the Kuwaiti context, and also its role in erasing and suppressing our diversity in order to fabricate the sense of sameness. And today, we will be joined by yet another wonderful group who I'll be introducing in just a little bit, in an effort to counter that single story. And so we're going to be digging deeper into the importance of hearing and sharing multiple perspectives when it comes to creating a more inclusive and representative public narrative. And to help us do that, we've invited some of the wonderful people and very brave individuals that have participated in our festival last year as storytellers, asking them to reflect on what that process looked like and how sharing stories might have changed the ways in which they've experienced their own communities. So before I introduce them to you guys, I just want to do a quick tech orientation. So if you could take a look at the bottom of the screen, you will find a panel and a Q&A section. And if you just click on the Q&A section, you're going to be able to type in any questions that you might have for our guest speakers or any of us facilitators. We're going to be trying to keep up with your questions and address them throughout the conversation. Or otherwise, we'll try to engage with them more deeply throughout the end of the conversation. And there's also another interesting feature which you guys could use in the Q&A section, which is to upvote. So if anyone submits a question which you really like and would like to hear the answer to, then you can also press the thumbs up button and it would be upvoted. And that's about it in terms of any introductions. And now on to our guest speakers. So today we have joined with us the woman who does it all. She's a journalist, she's a private sector leader, and an active and very well-respected member of the community. Iman Al-Awadi, if you could say hello to everyone.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us, Iman. So Iman actually participated as one in our festival last year as one of the 8 brave storytellers who decided to share their personal stories with us. And in her story, she shared a collection of snapshots about key moments and turning points in her life and the deeper choices and challenges that they each revealed about her. So we're going to hear a bit more about that process today. Also joined with us is Batul Al-Shimri. Batul, where are you?
I'm right here.
Hi, Batul. So
Hello there.
Batul told us the story about her discovery of a difficult truth about her family and herself at age 14. How she accidentally learned that she was Badoon, and the unexpected journey of self-discovery that it led her towards. She told us about the many questions and the truths that she had to confront about what she knew to be her identity and her future. And we also have another second Batul, so I'm going to have to be distinguishing between you guys and mention your last names as well. Batul Sadliwala, say hello to everyone.
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Envy, for putting together this panel.
Thank you for joining us. So Batul also was one of our brave storytellers. She shared and reflected with us her interactions and the relationships that she has or continues to have with certain labels that she continues to strive or shed reclaim. These labels include expat, albino, tough, quiet, and inspiring. And she tells us more about what that experience was like in her story. And last but not least, we have the wonderful Zainab Mirza. Zainab.
Hello, everyone. So great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Zainab. So Zainab has always thrived on experiences of diversity, and she's always inspired us with her writing, which is published online and also in print. She's the co-founder of the Divan, and she aspires to make meaningful contributions to expatriate literature in the Gulf. At the festival, Zainab performed an original and immersive short story that she developed called Conversations with Cabbies. So thank you all so much for joining us. Before I give the floor to you and ask you a bunch of questions, I thought it would be an interesting idea to actually do a quick icebreaker activity with everyone that is attending this webinar. So throughout the process of designing and planning the festival last year, we were in a long process of looking for stories to share as part of the platform and a part of the festival. And so we asked a lot of people across different communities to reflect on their own experiences and their own stories of belonging, exclusion, and personal agency. And so we'd like for you all to take a moment before we get started on today's discussion to think about your own stories related to these themes. Some of you might have already done this with us before, but I'm sure you're going to have a lot more stories to recall and memories to recall being in quarantine. So if I could just ask you all to get comfortable for a few minutes and take a deep breath in, holding it in for a few seconds and breathing it out. Once again, breathing in deeply and releasing for one last time, in and out. Now, if you could just close your eyes and take a moment to think back to a time that you felt a sense of belonging. Perhaps you were sitting at home, around family, or a loved one. What did that feel like? What did it feel like to belong? Sit with that feeling. Was it perhaps a sense of comfort, safety, a feeling of security? Did you feel recognized and loved for who you are? Who was with you sharing that memory? And once you close in on what that experience felt like, just sitting with that emotion and sitting with that memory for a few seconds. And then once you're comfortable and you're ready, opening your eyes. So when we talk about community building, what we're aiming to do is foster that very same sense of belonging that you guys just felt. We are trying to do this on a wider level. We're trying to do this within and across the communities that we exist in. And in order for that to really happen, we need to feel seen and accepted for who we are. So thank you for taking part of that exercise. And we would absolutely love to hear from you on the stories that came up during this icebreaker, this exercise, if you'd like to share it. So feel free to do so on our Instagram or any one of our platforms at Envy Earth. We've been collecting stories around these themes and around the theme of belonging for the past year and continue to do so. So make sure to write them down and share that with us if you're comfortable. And now to move on to the questions for our wonderful guest speakers and storytellers. I'm going to start with you, Batul Sadliwala. So in a lot of the conversations that we've had, we talked about how stories can either free you or trap you in a certain stereotype. So how can stories that allow us to address or confront the stereotypes or some of the labels that people attach to us, be shared whilst also giving us a more nuanced idea of who we are as an individual? So kind of there's this tug of war between, let's say, confronting a specific label or confronting a specific stereotype. As much as we want to highlight that experience or counter it and reclaim our narrative, we find issues and sometimes feeling trapped by that label and by that story. So I want to ask you, Batul, in your personal experience with the festival, what was that experience like for you, or what were some of the choices that you had to make in the telling of your story to navigate these issues?
So there are, I think, a couple of points to this. It's not an easy thing to do, and it's definitely not something that comes to many of us very naturally. That is to think about how we craft the story. So, of course, it's very different when you are, for example, for Iman, Batul, and myself, we were sharing personal stories, right? So that itself is different than sharing someone else's story, which is the case with Zainab. For me, it came down to thinking about how could I talk about albinism, right? Which was sort of the main highlight of the story, without falling back into the same sort of the tropes that I've experienced throughout my life of being a person with albinism. And that is, I managed to do that only through highlighting moments that were, I mean, and the strategies again may differ from story to story, from person to person, and across life experiences. But for me, from a tactical perspective, it worked to talk about just very, I want to use the word microaggressions, but perhaps it's not quite the right word, but these very subtle moments in everyday life where that feature of my existence was, without being very obvious, still at the forefront of my experience, right? Now, I can't say that I'm not a person with albinism. I can't disown that label because it's a genetic condition. I have had it since birth. I will always have it. I will always look this way and see this way. So the question then is, how do I take that reality, but then sort of, flip it on its head, like flip people's understandings of what my experience would be. So that's what I try to do, like use these subtle moments from my experience and sort of switch the narrative, like talk about what actually happened, what I felt versus what people expected me to feel.
Thank you, Batul. It's very interesting. I remember in the last conversation we had, you said something which really resonated. You said that good stories invoke empathy and not sympathy. And I think that's one of the many powerful roles of stories as reclamation. I think once you take ownership over your narrative and make choices about how you want to represent yourself, so part of your identity, it becomes a lot easier to mitigate these things or to highlight some of the more complex nuances about your identity. So thank you so much for addressing that. My next
Sorry,
question.
can I just jump in very quickly?
Of course.
Sorry, you can't see me.
Oh yes, here you are.
There I am. I think that's a very important point, and I just wanted to stress on that a little more, this difference between stories evoking empathy versus sympathy. Could we maybe clarify that a little, or like what's the difference and why is that important? Batul?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's very simple, right? Think of the reaction that people have. So when often the reaction that I get, and just generally, or have got throughout my life, when people come to know that I have this condition and that it does affect my vision and that it can't be corrected, it's a mixed bag. It broadly falls into two categories of curiosity and another category of what I call mild pity. And so the mild pity category, right, is the category of sympathy, is when, as a listener of someone's story, if your reaction is, oh, I feel so sorry for them. Oh, I could never imagine myself being in this situation. Oh, my life is actually so much better. That's sympathy. And that's the kind of reaction through your storytelling, you definitely want to stay away from. And empathy, I think, is much more nuanced. So for me, empathy does entail some level of curiosity. So you want to know a little bit more about that person's experiences. You want to also address perhaps, you may also feel a sense of indignation that results from that story, especially if it's a story about social justice, right? If it's a story about how someone's being wronged by a society or an institution, then you also want to leave your audience with a sense of, yeah, that was not right? Like that's something we as a society need to think about.
Thank you, Batul. So yeah, I think you touched on something in your point, Batul, about also how people receive your story and how people experience it. And this also came up in one of the conversations we had. You can't really, the minute that you share your narrative, you almost have to let go of a part of it and realize or confront the reality of the fact that no two people will experience the narrative or the narrative that you're sharing the same way. So I think all of you can almost agree that the experience of sharing a personal narrative or a story with a group of strangers is always nerve-wracking or makes you feel somewhat vulnerable and exposed. And I know each of you actually had quite varying experiences when it came to this. But that was especially the case for both of you, Iman and Batul Shimiri. So if you could both tell me a bit more about what people's responses and reactions were to your stories, and how that affected your experience of telling it.
Iman, do you want to go first or should I go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. So to me, to be honest, the reaction was more of what Batul just explained. Like it was more, I did find people coming up to me and telling me that they were sorry. And you could feel like they felt like it's their fault. While that's not what I wanted to instigate in them. But then again, I don't think you have the power to kind of make people feel what you want them to feel. You can only, I don't know, have control over what you say and how you feel, mostly. So that's one thing I have to actually like reactively figure that out in my head. So yeah, I don't know. Does that answer the question a little bit?
Yes. And Iman, if I could hear from you, or before we go on to Iman, Eleanor, did you want to say something, or did I just?
No, I was really interested in this. I really was very interested in the bookends, if you like, of Batul Al-Shamri's experience of telling the story, what happened when you released it into the world, if you like, to a number of strangers, and the experience that Iman had with that. And I think the thing that really struck me about what you said, Batul, in our conversation, and it does speak also to what Batul Sadliwala was talking about, is the difference between sort of a story emancipating you, making you feel like, I put that story out there and it somehow is very freeing, or you put the story out there anticipating that and maybe experiencing that in that moment, and then you said, but then I was suddenly trapped in my story. Yeah. I was trapped in that, which goes back to what we talked about with Batul Sadliwala saying, trying to craft the story around these microaggressions to kind of trigger people's understanding, but not tip them over into this sort of pity or super labeling, so that was interesting. And then Iman, if you talk about your experience, it was so different when you sort of let your story out into the world. Right. I find it fascinating because you can't control either of those, but they both have an impact on you.
Actually, my greatest concern, or my greatest kind of the sense of dread I had, was because my family was in the audience. So my parents were there, and they were a lot of the moments in my life that I shared, they'd actually been there, kind of bearing witness to them. So I know my mom was in tears, and I think the impact of actually telling the story from the point of view of a little girl, or maybe a teenage girl, or whatever stage of life I was in, kind of brought them back to different moments and helped them see and feel what I felt. A little bit like what Batul was talking about, empathy. When you when people show empathy, they're actually putting themselves in your place. And so they're better understanding of your motives and what makes you basically tick, or what has made you the person that you are today. In terms of the audience, my biggest challenge was that I was telling a story that I wasn't completely convinced was going to be helpful to anyone, or was going to kind of identify with them. But to be very honest, as I was standing there on that stage, everybody in the audience was completely quiet. Everybody was completely focused. You know, usually you get these people who kind of whisper in the background, or they're twiddling around with, their hair or whatever. There was none of that. And as I looked at them, I felt the strength of that positive energy. And I felt that maybe for a lot of them, maybe my story didn't particularly mean anything to them, but maybe it helped take them back to certain moments in their lives where they could identify with similar circumstances or similar moments that they'd been through, and that had helped shape who they are in the present day.
Can you also, I mean, the other thing that I thought was really interesting that you brought out of that was also that you said there was something about, we asked you sort of, how is it different to tell your story to a big group of strangers than to just have your story, on your own, just so you know your story, or you have to discover your story. And then we sort of asked, but so what? You could sit in your room and have this story, or you could tell one person. What's the difference between sort of sharing that story communally? What happened to you in that?
I think it's sort of like it's like a confession. It's like when you put things out in words, whether spoken or written, you've actually made them real. They're no longer just an idea in your head. And so in a sense, one could actually say that you hold yourself accountable to the person that you have become through sharing that with other people. So now it's not just me thinking that I need to be, or I need to behave in a certain way, or I need to hold myself up to a certain standard. I've actually shared that with the world, and now they can hold me accountable to that. So I think it's very liberating in a sense, and it also raises that sense of responsibility, personal responsibility to yourself before anyone else.
Batul, did you were shaking your head? I saw Batul Shamri. Did you have? It looked like that resonated to you.
Yeah, for sure. Exactly what Iman said. Like once you say it, like I feel like it kind of gets hard to change your mind because you said it and it's the only truth that's there. Well, maybe in a couple of years, maybe I'll change my mind, and it's hard because you always want to come out as genuine to other people. So that might create, I don't know, an issue in people perceiving what you're saying as maybe not as genuine. Well, yeah. So I don't know, that resonated with me a little bit.
I think that resonated with me as well. And I remember, I sometimes, just to clear my head, I will write down some poetry in a scrappy notebook. And the day after Awaken, I wrote down a few words, and basically it was a reflection on how, though immediately after sharing my story, I felt very content and just at peace. The next day, I felt a little bit that I had lost control of the story of what I'd shared. Right, that it was now this entity that was somehow separate from me and belonged to the people who had heard it as well, and not just myself. So I think I'm really happy to hear that Batul and Iman had a similar experience as well.
Mm-hmm. It's quite interesting that you say that, actually, because I've experienced that personally. I'm curious to know if anyone else has. It's this double-edged experience of, on one level, you feel almost seen and heard by sharing your narrative and doing that very scary experience of stepping up into a public space and sharing something that you hold very true to who you are as a person, or very intimately to who you are. But then also at the same time, it brings on this, I don't know how to put it, not fear, but almost you have to just trust that your story is being held in a way that is authentic, that is genuine, that is careful almost. Did anyone else experience that feeling, or both of these experiences? Iman, I see you.
I know you see me, but I don't really have an answer to that.
Well, I think that brings us sort of to the next sort of thing that we were thinking about, Leon, which is, you know, the role of, you know, sort of the role of the person who tells the story, and then the role of the person who receives the story, and you know, we've been trying so hard to create safe spaces for these stories to land in, you know, because as we all know from social media and from what we see going on with COVID, you have all kind of different stories landing in different places, and creating different kinds of ripples in communities. So we kind of want your stories, we wanted them to land in a safe way. And one of the things that was really curious, I think, was Zainab's role in this, which Batul, you brought up with Zainab, the role of being both a storyteller and a listener.
Yeah, Zainab, I think you were the only person who didn't share their own personal stories. You shared kind of series of stories that you gathered from a lot of the conversations that you were having in the cab rides that you went on. So you had a unique position of being, as Eleanor said, both the storyteller and story listener. And so I wanted to ask you, what was your experience like as a listener? Did being a listener shift the way in which you viewed the broader community that you lived in any way? Did it offer you a form of new perspective or compassion? How did it affect you?
Thank you, Lan. So just for to offer a bit of background, I've been using cabs to get around for years, and I had a couple of bad experiences with while hailing street cabs. So that made me come to a point where I wouldn't speak to cab drivers at all, except to tell them where I wanted to go, and that's about it. And there was this one conversation I had which changed everything henceforth, which was with an Afghan cab driver who just, we slipped into a conversation somehow, and he told me about his family, how long he was in Kuwait, and that he just visited his family in Afghanistan, in Kabul. And I asked him whether he thought about moving back, because he seemed to really care about them. And he said, how can I? Because I'm supporting 37 people. And it just shook me, the idea that of one person supporting that many people by himself in a country where he doesn't have any relatives or family, where he doesn't speak the language. And it was very moving. And it sort of made me realize that there are so many conversations I can have to understand where they're coming from. And that's what I proceeded to do. And I had them with people from different cultural backgrounds, which were really interesting, like people from Pakistan, from India, from Bangladesh. It helped because I could speak Hindi and they could communicate with me. So there we shared a commonality which made it easier to communicate. And as I learned more and more about where they're coming from and how they struggle, it just made me check my own biases and prejudices that I had held, and re-examine them. And there has been so much stigma. So many people I know drive. There are very few people we know who don't have a license and don't get around cabs. So it's easy to fall into the beliefs that are perpetuated about cabs not being safe, and it's not safe to travel in them. And something could happen to you, you know. So, and I really wanted to change that, because besides this, the question of safety, I also recently came to know that there is a stigma of shame, that it's shameful to ride a cab. And I really wanted to, as someone who uses up to like 3 cabs a day, obviously outside of lockdown, it really, it's something I really wanted to tackle. And when I had the opportunity, I really wanted to address it. As in terms of retelling the story, I just wanted, I really felt the responsibility of making sure that I delivered their perspective and their point of view, so that people could understand their position and, you know, where they're coming from.
I think you bring up a very important thing as well. I think we've talked about, especially in the last two episodes, our role as storytellers, but also there's a very big role to be played, I think, as a listener of someone else's story, and in your unique role as well in not only listening but then retelling and resharing the stories of these different people that you met along your journey. So what are some of the factors, if any, that you considered or you kind of had to be mindful of or keep in mind when you were sharing these stories?
Well, I was really afraid of not delivering those stories authentically. I was afraid of, like, I wanted to be very clear that I had my own biases, and I wasn't like it's not, for instance, there are questions of safety, and you do have to be careful, of course. So you have to take your own safety into consideration before having these conversations, right? So, and I also wanted to make sure that, like, basically to be clear about their experiences, to make sure that I repeated the conversations verbatim, just so that they were clear, that their perspectives were clearer. And I think going back to what you were saying regarding listening, I feel like I've always felt one of the greatest roles of literature, for instance, for me has been to understand where other people are coming from. So, for instance, reading a book called The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime made me understand the perspective of a child with autism. And it's so important for us as listeners to expose ourselves to stories of different communities, of people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, and not just stay within our own bubbles of our own backgrounds.
Layan, if I can just jump in, I had a follow-up question for Zainab, actually, because I think this is it's something that I'm personally very curious about. This idea of, again, going back to sharing other people's stories, right? Because sometimes the people whose stories you feel need to be heard are not in a position, or do not have the privilege, or do not have the platforms, right, to share the stories themselves. And especially as an activist, that is something, that comes up pretty regularly. But then there's the whole question of appropriation, right? Of taking advantage or taking ownership over other people's stories and maybe not portraying them in the way that they would have. And it kind of reminds me of the whole controversy over the novel American Dirt. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that.
Yeah,
right?
I've heard of it. Yeah.
So it was an extremely popular novel. Basically, this American author that decided that more stories of the migrant communities crossing over from Mexico into the U.S. should be heard, and that was basically to change people's mindsets towards these communities. They had to be given a voice, and they had to be given a face. And if we did that, then maybe people wouldn't be okay with them being locked up in cages at the border and so on and so forth. And she published this very, very, very successful, popular novel, Oprah's book club, etc.
Yeah, I was really surprised that Oprah had her on for 2 interviews.
But then there was this huge, pushback from the actual Latino community saying, well, that was not your story to tell, because you are putting your own, because you're not from that community, you're putting your own kind of biases and experiences in the telling of our story, which is not your story. I wonder what you thought about that.
I definitely I do see that, and so for instance, for me, I would only I feel like that my background from like being from India myself, that created a common ground on which I could communicate with these cab drivers with, because, like, for instance, I would not be able to have that conversation with Arab cab drivers, and that's, I feel, a story for somebody else to tell if somebody steps up to tell it. And there have been, like, over the years, as an Indian expat myself, I've seen so many racist prejudices, and I've seen them being perpetuated against people from different socioeconomic backgrounds who are from, say, India or Bangladesh. And I really wanted to tackle that. So I do, I honestly, I'm not going to speak about American Dirt because I'm not so familiar with that, but I was very conscious about that. So I made sure that I was only speaking about cab drivers where I felt a connection with, and who felt that connection with me, because they would, it's just very obvious from the way they would speak, like, oh, you're from India, or oh, you speak Hindi, you know. So it was easy to be able to tell that story.
Can I jump right in, if that's
Of
possible?
course.
So to be honest, that's very interesting, because if we're gonna go along these lines, I call it, I don't know, it's called, I don't know what to call it, but it feels a little bit like we're being, I don't know, we're not telling people stories. In a way, we're just giving a voice for people that can be heard. For sure, like, I don't know, in the case of American Dirt, like the one that you just mentioned, I feel like the author might have not done anything that's wrong by telling the story of people that probably don't have the platform to get their voice heard. I don't find anything wrong with that, as long as you're empowering people from that, I don't know, demographic to be able to find their voice. Sometimes when you're at a place of privilege, you need people that are privileged to push you up. You know, it's like, I don't know, have you guys seen a picture of like equity versus equality? I think Envy posted it the other day, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it
So
was
let's just imagine, yeah. Maybe it's like, just imagine like people telling that story is that like little crate that people are pushing you to give you a platform, give more people a voice to speak. That's just, I don't know, my take on it. I might be wrong, but my opinion.
Yeah, I don't think I totally agree. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. And even in terms of American Dirt, like, I understand the cultural appropriation argument fully. And I think Zainab makes a great point in the sense that, you know, and she was telling the story of her community anyways. I mean, it's people that she could relate to and has, you know, strong ties to, and kind of understands that experience. And same thing with, I think with American Dirt, in my opinion, in the end, it's a novel, right? So I think if we can only share stories that we've lived personally, then that's the end of fiction, right?
Yeah,
so I think it's
sure.
a bit too much, too much responsibility to put on an author. I mean, in the end, you're telling stories, right? Okay, they shouldn't be taken as this is the experience of the immigrant community, of the migrant community coming to the US, because it's not them telling the story, but it is still a story that I think could bring, you know, attention on the issue. And so, yeah, no easy answer.
If I can jump in on that point, I think I would disagree to the idea that there is no answer to it, that there's no right and wrong, because it sort of goes back to how the story is told and what the author acknowledges about their own position and their own relationship with the community, whether it's their own or it's a community that is not theirs, right? Again, so I'm not familiar with American Dirt, so I won't comment on it, but and you know, you see, I think this argument come up in academia as well. So in fields like anthropology, especially when people are studying different cultures. So like, for example, you know, why do only Western scholars write so much about Kuwait and the other Gulf countries, right? Why we need to have more people from the Gulf writing about the Gulf, for example. You hear this a lot. But the question really comes in, it doesn't really matter at a base level just who the person is or where they come from and who they're writing about, but really how they write about it, right?
Right.
So it's because it's possible for me, even as someone who has lived in Kuwait, to write something that is very essentializing about Kuwait. Like I can do it. Should I? No, right? It's about making that sort of nuanced distinction, right? And that's what distinguishes good literature from bad, right? Because you are engaged with the material, but you're also engaging with an author's perspective and an author's style, and implicitly.
Right. But that doesn't mean that you can't write about other people's experiences.
Of course,
right?
no. Yeah, no. Yeah,
I
it's just
agree.
how you do it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
I think with stories as well, like sharing, I think if you're talking about the culture of sharing oral stories, right? I think in Kuwait, of course, we are still at a point where we are far from the place where the most vulnerable in our country, in our community, have a platform where they feel heard and safe. We're really far away from it. So at this point, it does help to have for those of us who have the privilege to then be bringing in those voices that aren't heard.
Yeah.
But what we also need to be doing concurrently is then building on that gap, like creating small spaces where the people whose lives we want to change or we want to uplift, they are the ones who are doing the speaking, right? So it's
Right.
this dual process, and one's definitely longer than the other.
For sure.
I think also, it makes me think as I was hearing you guys speak, it tells you more about the power of stories, and this is something that we really got into in the second episode that all three al-Naqibs mentioned. I think it also has to do with what are the narratives that are being shared and that are being told in the community, right? So, for example, right now in the crisis, we've been hearing a lot of different narratives that have come up about, representing certain parts of the population, let's say more of the expatriate population, and what their intentions are or what they serve to kind of create or perpetuate in the society. So I think the more you start to share these authentic narratives, whether they're, like you guys said, told firsthand or told as a secondhand story, it still feeds that purpose. It feeds to humanize these narratives and bring light the different subjective experiences that people have, and break down the narratives that are being told to, let's say, vilify a group of people or pin them down under one idea. And I think actually this would be a good time, Elisa, to bring out our poll question for everyone in the audience, because I
The
think
first one?
that, yes, the have you ever heard a...
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you guys, you're going to get a pop-up on your screens for you all to join in on this poll question, which is, have you ever had a strong stereotype or belief or opinion that completely changed because of a story that you heard? And I think a question like this always reminds me, I've mentioned this quite a few times to Elisa and Eleanor, so sorry, you're going to have to hear this again. But it reminds me of the story of the parable, of the blind men and the elephant, which I really like. I'm not sure if you guys have heard it, but basically a group of blind men come across an elephant for the first time, and as they're trying to understand what this thing is and conceptualize in their mind what it looks like, they start to feel different parts of the elephant, and each one, of course, in their experience of talking about what that experience, in sharing the story about what that experience was like, they all described the different parts. So one felt the tusk, one felt the tail, one felt the leg, and everyone claims it's the perfect way to represent kind of a lot of the ways in which we claim absolute truth to the stories that we hold or our experiences of certain things or certain people in the community, versus opening up the space for us all to acknowledge and be open to our different experience and perspectives. So we got the results, and 90% have answered yes. They have felt that a stereotype or belief or opinion because of the story. Very, very interesting. I want to ask you guys my next question. This one, you can all answer. What would you guys say to anyone perhaps that is here, that is listening to this conversation, who's reluctant or afraid about sharing their personal stories, whether this is done privately or publicly. Why would you guys recommend that they do it, or what can they expect from the process itself?
Or not, feel free.
Okay. I think I'll go ahead since nobody has yet. Okay. So to be honest, I think we're already in a sense all sharing stories. Like the fact when you talk to your mom and you tell her about your day, you're sharing a story. When you talk to your friend, you're sharing a story. So in a sense, we're all storytellers on different magnitudes, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
the only part which I feel like I got the chance to do, and if any of you that are listening get the chance to do, you should 100% embrace and do. It's scary, yes, but you come out of it and you feel like, wow, I feel heard. I feel like I just had like the biggest hug from everybody. You'd end up feeling like a burrito, almost like hugged and like, it feels good. It feels really good. So I don't know, it makes you feel empowered, like you own your story. Yeah, you should definitely do it, 100%. Not pushing you though.
Iman, I know you had something to say.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to say, well, I'm now at an age where I've lived pretty much more than half my life. And I always have this question in the back of my mind is like, I mean, what have I done to account for these 40 plus years that I've been on this planet, right? And in doing this exercise of storytelling and going back to think about the turning points in my life, where the moments that have changed me, has helped me kind of deal with that question in a lot of ways, because I realized the different struggles or the different challenges that I had to overcome, and the kind of strength that I needed to have, and the strong will that I had to actually make that change, because you've got to want to change in order to get it done. And that has helped me kind of come to terms with that. No, I have come a long way. And so from that perspective, it's very liberating to tell your story. Even if you don't believe that it might not make sense to everybody. It's still an experience, and it's still on the personal level, it matters very much to me as an individual.
I think also the process, like you said, the process of preparing to share your story, or I mean, Iman and I did this a lot too. It was really interesting when you and I.
Oh
went
yeah, it was a
through the
very
process.
long process, very long.
Yeah, and it's usually the case. I mean, some people, I think with maybe Batul Shimiri, it was she had too many stories to share and didn't know how to filter between them. Or with Iman, you and I sat down together and we looked at all the different stories and trying to find, like, pull on the different threads, but find something that is unified, or your narrative arc which you could actually share and pull from. So I think also the whole process of trying to define your stories and your life experiences, finding common themes and threads across them, is also very insightful. It helps you find connections, and it helps you process a lot of the things that you've experienced. So I usually like the process as well, as Elisa will vouch for. I'm a process-oriented person.
Very
Anyone
much so.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to add a few words there. Maybe not whether you should do it or not. I think that someone's really depends on how comfortable you are. But I think maybe a word of caution in that, going back to the point about like feeling stuck, right? And I think Batul mentioned something about was it Batul or Iman? I can't remember. I think Batul mentioned something about like not being boxed in, right, with the story, like just hang that one label on you.
Yeah.
Is and also like, maybe that your story changes. Like a few years later, you listen to a recording or something, and you're like, I don't feel the same way anymore, right? Or my reality is very different now. So I think being okay with that, right? To know that it's completely fine that your story will change, because that's life. We are works in progress. And so, even if I had to redo my story for Awaken like tomorrow, I may do it differently than I did it in November, right? So keep that in mind. You're not someone who's cast in stone. You're going to keep changing, and you have multiple stories, right? So I think going back to what Layan was saying, like it's of picking out the stories and picking out the strands, that process is definitely helpful. and it like really makes you reflect on your experiences and your emotions. But I think often I find something that I found more interesting as well was to reflect on your own, on parts of your life where you haven't acted well, right? Where you could have been a better you. I think that's also a valuable story to tell, if not to a wide audience, at least to yourself, at least perhaps to the people who you love and care for, and therefore know also about why you're telling the story. Have like a broad idea of why do I want to share about my experience with, in my case, albinism, or my experience with my nationality, or my experience as a Kuwaiti empowered woman, right? Yeah.
Elisa, did you want to read out? I think we
Sure.
received comments from the
If
audience.
Zainab didn't want to jump in the why you should share your story, I just wanted to read out this comment that we got from the audience. It's not a question; it's a comment related back to our conversation about the sharing other people's stories and the stories of people from other communities. They mentioned, Notting Hill mentions that in London there's an ongoing debate between vulnerable communities slash people of color and society at large, and it trickles down to the idea of taking up or occupying space that is best shared or reserved for others. If you are from privileged and are able and willing to create such a space, then it is your responsibility not to occupy it and facilitate an opening for those who are less fortunate to have a voice. The Good Immigrant is an example of a book that has been very successful in documenting migrant stories in the UK and then the US, initiated by a person of color, engaging with people from their community and giving them a voice, both emerging and achieving. Yes, for sure. We agree. I mean, I agree. And Envy, obviously, we agree, which is why through Awaken, that is what we aim to do. We're not sharing other people's stories, right? We try to provide that platform for people to share their own, and for different diverse communities to be able to represent themselves, basically, in that process. I don't know if anybody wanted to add something. Oh, wait, we have another question here. If we could ask the guests their thoughts about the act of asking for permission to tell somebody's story, whether it's external or internal, i.e. self-censorship. Okay, so basically, the act of asking for permission to tell their story. I guess maybe relating back to when you decide the story that you want to tell, what is what you decide that is okay to share or not, whether it's your own personal story, as in things that you kind of have to censor, whether it's to protect your family, your loved ones, or things like that, or in representing other people's stories, that process of censorship, and maybe asking people before you share their stories, or the people that were in your story, do you ask them for permission to share the story that they were a part of? What do you, any thoughts on that?
I think, I don't know if I'm getting this wrong, but I think this actually has come up in some of our conversations, actually, with Zainab and Batul Sadliwala. We talked about having to kind of self-center when it comes to certain things that are maybe more sensitive to talk about, whether in light of the political context or the social context or familial context. So kind of making that choice about what it is that we are choosing to share and what it is that we're choosing to hold in our stories.
I think that also, I mean, obviously, there is no story with one character, right? So there's always going to be people in that scene, and there are going to be people when you describe them that people around you will know who they are, even if you don't mention their names, if you don't, if you try to obscure kind of who that character is. And I think it comes down to this: your story is how you feel in that moment. It's what you see. And if that person were asked to recount that same scene, it will probably sound very different because they have their own emotions and their own kind of background and things that they're bringing into it. So, I mean, I think that would be very similar in this case specifically. That would be very similar to asking somebody permission to speak about my feelings, which I don't think is something that we can do in every instant, right? I think it's important to bear in mind the consequences of what you're going to say. So obviously, if you're speaking out in public and it's going to be something that might damage you or put you in a peculiar kind of situation, then you have to kind of, I wouldn't say self-center, but you'd have to go around it. But then you also have the obligation of being true to yourself and also true to your audience in projecting your emotions and the impact, and kind of, if you can't tell the story truthfully, then you shouldn't be telling it at all. It's like taking a painting, for example. If I were to look at the Mona Lisa right now and decide that I didn't like this nose, I can't cut off the nose and kind of take a photo of my own nose and stick it there just because, you know, I don't want anyone to recognize this nose, kind of thing, you know? You can't do that. It's either, it's a complete piece of art, or it's a complete piece of creation that should be presented in that form, I believe. But again, I mean, it's a debate.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's very well said, Iman. I completely agree with you on the fact that if you don't feel true, then there's perhaps not much point sharing it. It's very well said. And also makes me think of, so especially in cases where you're sharing your story, but then you're concerned about the consequences for the other characters in it. It is definitely very contextual. It depends on your relationship with those people, your political, socioeconomic context, your audience as well, right? For example, it may be safe to say something in one setting, and it may be unsafe to do so in another setting. But also, perhaps in some cases, it's really about, it may even be about the facts, right? The facts rather than someone's emotions. So if in the case of me sharing my personal story, if that involves me divulging certain key facts or experiences of the lives of my loved ones, then yes, I would ask for permission, because those facts have had consequences for them and they hold them dear, right? But in the case, if the degree is not as high, if the stakes aren't as high. So for example, I talked about my parents a little bit in my story. And I came to the assumption, like, yeah, I've had similar conversations with my parents before to some degree. So it's going to be okay. They're not going to be hurt by me sharing it, right? There was something else that I had when we had the workshops, right? I think I spoke to Eleanor, that there was something I wanted to speak about, but I eventually didn't, because it did involve me talking about a loved one and revealing parts of their life that even now, to my judgment, I'm like, I have no right to be talking about it. So again, I think it's very contextual. It really depends on the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone else wanted to answer that before I moved on, I just noticed the time, and I think we should go ahead and maybe I'll ask you guys my final question. So just like Batul just touched on, I'm not sure if everyone knows this, but just to give a bit more context, we went through a long process of sitting together and working through all of our stories as we prepared to share them at the festival. And we held a residency over a few weeks where all of you guys, and there was also another couple of you, we were a total of 8 storytellers that dig deeper into their own personal narratives and looked at how do we turn that into a narrative arc and then share it with a group of people in a public event almost. So throughout that process, I think all of you got a chance to really connect with one another, to connect across your experiences and across your perspectives. And I wanted to ask you guys what that experience was like for you, because it's a testament to, I think, what happens when we step out of our own communities and into someone else's, and when we really listen, what these stories make us realize about ourselves and about each other. So I was just curious to know any of the highlights or the things that.
For me, I think the biggest takeaway was came from the diverse group that we had as storytellers, the different backgrounds they came from, the different experiences that they were telling, and this ability to create this safe space. I mean, I didn't think it was going to be possible, honestly, until I was actually a part of it. Yeah, I think for me that was the biggest takeaway.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. Everybody's so nice. Nobody wants to like jump in. Okay, I'll jump in. So, to be honest, okay, wait, can you repeat the question? Sorry, I know. I forgot a little bit.
Sure. I just wanted to ask kind of what came out in your experience throughout the process as we kind of gathered and connected and went through the experiences, digging really deeper into your own personal experiences. And I mean, it's a very vulnerable thing to do that, but also to do it with a group of people who you went into this process with not knowing, and then coming out kind of supporting and helping each other through the process of not only defining your own stories, but each other's stories. So what were the highlights of that experience? What did you learn?
And specifically, again, not necessarily about your own story, but the hearing other people's stories and going through that process, where being a part of that process where they're, sharing their own stories and coming to find their narrative arc and sharing these experiences that are very different from your own.
Okay, so to be honest, for me, it was a lot of things. One, I realized that you connect through trauma. I know we hear that a lot, but you connect with people that have gone through something that's difficult. And I feel like at some point throughout the residency, throughout telling our stories, we all, I don't know, broke down or got emotional, or maybe it got to us somehow. And I feel like it connected me. Like, Diane, remember at the beginning when you asked us to like imagine like a place where you felt like you belonged? Or to me, I instantly went back to the Awaken Festival. I didn't even have to think twice about it because I honestly felt like I belonged. And two, I realized that there is still trauma that I need to work through. I thought I had it all. I thought that I worked through the trauma of owning my narrative, but no, I still have a lot of trauma which I need to work on, and it humbled me down because I thought I was over that part, but apparently no. So I need to work on that too, and I made a lot of friends too outside that. So I think that was either from the audience, like, oh my god, the audience were amazing. The audience were really amazing. So yeah, definitely all of these all together. I'm done.
I think we're all too polite because it's Zoom and the whole virtual webinar thing is new. So we're also trying to work through it. Yeah. I know I am at least. It's like, it's going to sound so ruckus if all four of us are speaking at once. But I think for me, again, like what Batul and Iman said is the process of just, sort of being in a room with all of you and the others, and Saif and Anne, and getting all of us talking about our stories and giving each other tips on even like just the practical bits about like, you should emphasize that section more, maybe move that, switch the narrative the other way around. Yeah, it was such a wonderful connecting experience. And I think the stories themselves, like for me, I've always found that Kuwait is interesting. So on the face of it, when an outsider looks at Kuwait, everyone thinks of, the stereotype oil-rich Gulf country, very wealthy, that's it. But we have so many stories. We have so much diversity. We have there's so much variety in our experiences for such a small place. And it was just one more really beautiful experience to learn a little bit more about that for me. And I really value that.
I'm going to jump in with what I learned from the experience. It was, I think, like one of the most important things I took away from Awaken and from listening to everyone's stories and from reflecting on the stories I'd been exposed to otherwise was that don't dismiss anyone just because of a limited interaction you may have with them. Like, don't make assumptions about people based on like a small interaction or a small encounter. And like there are so many nuances to a person, and there are so like each one of us is full of stories that we may not necessarily have a chance to hear, which is awesome because that means there are so many stories left to listen to and tell. And it reminded me of the last line of my story, which was, no matter where we're from, we're all just human beings trying to get by. And I think that's like so important to just remember. And I keep telling myself that also whenever I find that I'm not honoring it. Thank you guys for the platform.
Thank you guys, seriously, for all your beautiful reflection. And thank you also for being a part of this process. I mean, we asked you to also take a risk, and it takes a lot of bravery to step into a space with people that you're not familiar with and own your narrative and share it publicly. So you guys are incredibly brave for doing that. And we really, really enjoyed the experience and thought it was very, very insightful for us as well. And I think also this, just as a wrapping point from me as well, I think when I was listening to you guys speak, it also brings up this element of choice, I think. And that's something that I talk to you about, Zainab, when it comes to even in your story or the choice that you made in every one of these rides, not to have that transactional relationship or consider it to be just another kind of drive or route from getting you from destination point A or point B, but it was an intentional choice that you made to indulge in a conversation, listen to stories, share stories of your own. And I think it's really easy sometimes to get distracted or get caught up in, you know, our lives, especially in a place like Kuwait, where there is a lot of segregation, at least in, let's say, our access to space. And so it's a little easier for us to not really interact with one another, interact across communities. And the minute we make the conscious choice and effort to start sharing our stories and connecting more authentically and more meaningfully with one another, that's when all this diversity comes out and the richness comes out. And we realize kind of just how rich the social fabric is here. So thank you all, seriously, for all the beautiful insights and reflections. If there was any question or any point that any of you wanted to make or didn't get a chance to make,
I'm sorry. While they reflect, I just wanted to jump in to our audience. Share your stories. We keep looking for storytellers and people and experiences to feature and showcase throughout our platforms. So if you're interested, reach out to us on Instagram, the tag that we just shared earlier. And I think, when reflecting kind of on what you just said, Leanne, in these times and going back to the kind of the theme of the series overall, which is on stories, crisis, and community. In times of crisis, it is especially important that we connect with each other as people beyond the barriers, beyond the divisions, especially now that we don't actually even see each other, right? We're all scooped up in our own homes. And it is kind of the ideal time with all this fear, all this panic, for prejudice and discrimination to get even worse. So we really need to be very proactive, I think, in making sure that we are sharing our diverse experiences and, again, giving space, offering up the space that we have to highlight the multiple perspectives and experiences that people are going through right now, and reminding, again, that in the end, as Zainab said, we're all just humans trying to get by, no matter where we're from. And nobody's out there to get you or your country or whatever. We're just all trying to survive, and let's do it as best we can. Yeah, just final thoughts from me, ladies.
Thank you, Lisa. Anyone else has any final thoughts before we
I
wrap?
have a final thought. I've had this in my mind for a while, but also just on what Elisa said, it's listen to the stories. But when we're talking about community building, when we're talking about social justice and equity, also remember to find a way to act on them. And yeah, that's it.
Very good point.
I think that's an excellent point to end on. Batul, did you want to say anything before I wrap?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for listening, because like I really appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Like Envy, the people. Thank you, honestly.
I just want to add one thing. When all this is over, please try to take a cab if you can and strike up a conversation with the cab driver.
Yes, also public transit is good for the environment.
Yes.
When all this
All
is
right,
over,
guys.
we're gonna need another, and we're gonna need another festival because
For sure. To
we
process
just need one.
everything.
Yes.
Thank you
Oh,
so
yes.
much, ladies.
The minute we can
Thank
start to
you.
gather publicly again, we'll be doing that. Thank you guys
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you
Thank
for
you so
being here, and
much.
thank you for everyone who attended this episode and the whole series, and
Thank
for being
you.
part of this experience with us. Good night. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Everybody.
Bye.
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 Bye.